afternoon, in the quiet suburb of Lekki, Lagos, lived a woman named Grace. She was the epitome of the perfect housewife, or so it seemed. Grace was in her late 30s, beautiful, with a warm smile that could light up a room. Her husband, Chike, was a successful businessman, often traveling for work, leaving Grace alone in their spacious, well-decorated home. They had 2 children, both in boarding school, so the house was often empty and silent, with only Grace to fill the void. Grace had been married for 15 years, and though her marriage was far from unhappy, it had lost the spark it once had. Chike was a good man, but he was distant, more focused on his work than on her. They rarely spent time together, and when they did, it was usually in comfortable silence, the kind that comes from years of familiarity, rather than passion. It was during one of Chike's frequent business trips that Grace first noticed Emeka, the neighbor's son. Emeka was in his early 20s, a university student who had come home for the holidays. He was tall, athletic, and had a charming, boyish smile that reminded Grace of what it felt like to be young and carefree. His parents, Mr. and Mrs. Okoro, were friendly with Grace and Chike, often inviting them over for dinner or small gathering. Emeka had always been polite to Grace, addressing her as Auntie. But there was a subtle shift in their interactions as the days went by. Grace found herself looking forward to his visits, the way he would drop by to check on her or ask if she needed help with anything. It started with small things. Quick chat over the fence, a shared laugh, a lingering look. Grace knew it was wrong to feel anything for Emeka beyond the fondness of a family friend. She couldn't help herself. There was something intoxicating about the way he looked at her, as if she was the only woman in the world. It was a feeling she hadn't experienced in years, and it awakened a longing in her that she thought had been buried for good. One hot afternoon, when the sun was high in the sky and the streets were deserted, Emeka came over to Grace's house. She was in the kitchen, preparing lunch, when she heard a knock at the door. Wiping her hands on a towel, she opened it to find Emeka standing there, a sheepish grin on his face. "Auntie Grace, good afternoon," he greeted, his voice warm and inviting. "Emeka, how are you?" Grace replied, trying to keep her tone casual, though her heart was beating a little faster than usual. "I'm fine, thank you. I was wondering if you needed any help with anything. My mom and dad are out, and I have nothing to do," he said, his eyes locking onto hers. Grace hesitated for a moment, then smiled. "Actually, I'm just about to have lunch. Would you like to join me?" Emeka's grin widened. "I'd love to, Auntie." Together in the small dining room, conversation flowing easily. Grace found herself laughing at Emeka's stories about university life, his playful banter, and the way he made her feel young again. After lunch, they moved to the living room, where they continued talking, the atmosphere growing more intimate with each passing minute. At some point, the conversation lulled, and they found themselves sitting in silence, the tension between them palpable. Grace looked at Emeka, her heart pounding in her chest, and saw the same emotions reflected in his eyes. Without thinking, she reached out and touched his hand. That simple touch was all it took. Emeka leaned in, closing the distance between them, and before she knew it, their lips met in a kiss that sent a jolt of electricity through her body. It was a kiss that held all the pent-up desire and longing she'd been suppressing for so long. When they finally pulled apart, both of them were breathless, staring at each other in shock. Grace knew she had crossed a line, one she could never uncross, but in that moment, she didn't care. All she knew was that she wanted more. "Emeka, we shouldn't," she began, her voice trembling. "I know, Auntie, but I can't help how I feel," Emeka replied, his voice low and filled with emotion. Neither could Grace. What started as a stolen kiss quickly escalated into something much more. Grace and Emeka began seeing each other in secret, taking advantage of the times when Chike was away on business, or when Mr. and Mrs. Okoro were out of the house. They met in Grace's home, in the afternoons when the neighborhood was quiet, or sometimes at Emeka's parents' house when they were away. Their affair was intense, passionate, and all-consuming. Grace felt alive in a way she hadn't in years, her days filled with anticipation for the next time she would see Emeka. He made her feel desired, wanted, and she reveled in the attention he gave her. But with each passing day, the guilt began to eat away at Grace. She knew what she was doing was wrong, that she was betraying her husband, her family, and her own moral values. Yet, she couldn't bring herself to end the affair. The thought of losing Emeka, going back to her lonely, monotonous life, was too painful to bear. Emeka, too, was conflicted. He cared deeply for Grace, but he also knew that their relationship was doomed from the start. There was no future for them, and the longer they continued, the more likely it was that they would be caught. The affair continued for several months, their encounters growing more frequent and more reckless. They were careful, but not careful enough. In a close-knit community like theirs, it was only a matter of time before someone noticed the change in Grace's behavior. The way she would disappear for hours at a time, or the way Emeka was always around when Chike was away. It was Mrs. Okoro who first noticed something was off. She had always liked Grace and thought of her as a good friend, but lately, she had noticed that Grace seemed distant, distracted. She also noticed that Emeka was spending a lot of time at Grace's house, more than what seemed normal. One day, while chatting with Grace over tea, Mrs. Okoro decided to bring up her concerns. "Grace, is everything okay? You seem a bit off lately," she said, her tone gentle but probing. Grace forced a smile, trying to hide the panic rising in her chest. "Oh, I'm fine, just a little tired. Chike has been traveling a lot, and it's been a bit lonely without the kids around." Mrs. Okoro nodded, but she wasn't convinced. "I understand, but if there's anything you need to talk about, you know you can always come to me, right?" "Of course," Grace replied, her smile tight. "Thank you, Mrs. Okoro." But as soon as Mrs. Okoro left, Grace felt a wave of fear wash over her. She knew she couldn't keep this up for much longer. People were starting to notice, and if the truth came out, it would destroy her family, her reputation, and everything she had worked so hard to build. As the days passed, Grace became more and more paranoid. She was constantly looking over her shoulder, worrying that someone would catch her and Emeka together. She started to distance herself from him, making excuses whenever he wanted to see her, hoping that by doing so, she could somehow salvage what was left of her marriage. But Emeka was not ready to let go. He was in love with Grace, and the thought of losing her was unbearable. He began to pressure her, insisting that they find a way to be together, to make their relationship work. One evening, after a particularly heated argument, Grace finally snapped. "Emeka, this has to stop. We can't keep doing this. It's not right, and we're gonna get caught," she said, her voice shaking with emotion. "But I love you, Grace," Emeka pleaded, his eyes filled with desperation. "I can't lose you." Grace felt a pang of guilt, knowing how much she had led him on, how much she had let her own selfish desires cloud her judgment. But she knew that continuing their affair would only lead to more pain, more destruction. "I'm sorry, Emeka, but this has to end," she said, tears streaming down her face. Emeka stared at her for a long moment, his expression a mix of anger and heartbreak. Without another word, he turned and walked out of the house, leaving Grace alone with her guilt and regret. For a few weeks, things seemed to return to normal. Grace threw herself into her duties as a wife and mother, trying to forget about Emeka and the affair. She avoided him as much as possible, and though it was painful, she knew it was the right thing to do. The damage had already been done. As Grace was getting ready for bed, she heard a knock at the door. It was late and Chike was away on another business trip. Confused, she went to answer it, only to find Mrs. Okoro standing on her doorstep, her face pale and her eyes wide with fear. "Grace, you need to come with me," she said, voice trembling. Grace's heart sank. "What happened?" she asked, already fearing the worst. "It's Emeka. There's been an accident. He's at the hospital. You need to come now," Mrs. Bang Okoro said, her voice cracking as she struggled to hold back tears. Grace felt like the ground had been pulled out from under her. Her mind raced as she grabbed her keys and followed Mrs. Okoro out the door. The drive to the hospital was a blur. Grace's hands shook on the steering wheel, and her heart pounded in her chest. All she could think about was Emeka. What had happened, how serious it was, and whether he would be okay. When they arrived at the hospital, they were met by Mr. Okoro, who was pacing the hallway outside the emergency room. His face was etched with worry, and when he saw Grace and his wife, he rushed over to them. "The doctors are with him now," Mr. Okoro said, voice hoarse. He was in a car accident. They said it was serious." Grace felt like she was going to be sick. She wanted to ask what had happened, how it could have happened, but the words wouldn't come. Instead, she just stood there, numb, as the minutes ticked by. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, a doctor emerged from the emergency room, his expression grim. "I'm sorry," the doctor began, his voice gentle but firm. "Emeka sustained severe injuries in the accident. We did everything we could, but he didn't make it." The world seemed to stop in that moment. Grace felt a cold, heavy weight settle in her chest, crushing her from the inside out. She could barely hear Mrs. Okoro's wails of grief. All she could think about was that Emeka was gone, and it was all her fault. Guys, kindly watch out for part 2. Will Emeka's death tear apart Grace's already fragile world? And how will the devastating truth of her affair unravel in the days to come?